Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mike Whitmer. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items I'd like to review. This webinar is being pre-recorded. As a result, we won't be able to take questions live. However, if you have any questions about today's webinar, please contact NCMIC. We'll be happy to address questions that you have and connect you to resources to help. Also, the recording of today's webinar will be emailed to registered attendees following the program. We will also post the recording in the resources section of ncmic.com. It does take a bit of time to process the recording and get it posted, so please be patient with us. Also, our next webinar will be January 18th, 2024 at 2 p.m. Central Time. I hope that you'll be able to join us for that. So let's go ahead and start today's program. I am super excited for today's webinar because we're talking with one of the true luminaries of the chiropractic profession, Dr. Lou Sportelli. Dr. Sportelli has been around the chiropractic profession for decades, graduating from Palmer College in Davenport, Iowa in 1962. He hit the ground running and quickly became an outspoken leader and advocate for the chiropractic profession. I could spend all of our time today reviewing Dr. Sportelli's extensive CV, but I'd rather take the time to hear his perspectives on where we've been as a profession, where we are currently, and where we're going. So Dr. Sportelli, welcome. It's wonderful to talk to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
So let's dive in. One of the things that I really enjoy about the chiropractic profession and working with the profession is its rich history. I know that you are not only a student of chiropractic history, but you've also made history. I think it's important to understand our history, to understand the challenges chiropractic has faced and overcome, so we can better understand our current and future challenges. What are some of the key battles in the history of the chiropractic profession, and how have they shaped where we are today?
Wow. Mike, we've had battles forever. We've had lots of battles ever since the profession kind of started. But the battles really, we were sort of insignificant as a profession, essentially from 1895 to roughly 1950. And once the servicemen started to take advantage of the GI Bill, and we started to have an influx of chiropractors around the country, and that decade of the 50s brought a lot of chiropractors into the country, and frankly a lot of chiropractic colleges as well. So the battles the battles that we've had, of course, the one main one that basically was sort of a problem for every battle we've had was the battle that began as a very clandestine kind of operation in 1963 when the American Medical Association decided to form a committee on quackery. And the committee on quackery on paper stated that its goal was first to contain and then to eliminate the profession of chiropractic. And that was 1963.
Right as you were coming into the profession.
I opened my office in June of 1963. And the entire profession was totally unaware of this enormous challenge that the AMA was about to launch on the profession. And it was a multi-pronged attack, very effective. It was an attack to destroy credibility among the consumers who would utilize our services, among the legislators who were going to essentially advance our profession legislatively, and through the research aspect in which the colleges and the educational component was to be prevented from having MDs teach at our institutions. So you talk about battles, that was the battle. And of course, that battle was sort of the one that nobody knew about until it was exposed when the lawsuit was filed in 1975. During the 1963 to 1975, we had a number of enormous battles. One of those battles was, and we're still fighting it today, Mike, and that is the battle for Medicare. It was passed in a very, very, very unusual language that has sort of been an albatross around the profession's neck ever since it was passed, because it was so narrowly constructed and confined. And then, of course, all the insurance companies that were going to reimburse chiropractic adopted Medicare. Then we had accreditation battles. I mean, remember, we were fighting to get accredited by the United States Department of Education. Then we had battles that we were dealing with for insurance companies. We were dealing with licensure battles because all the chiropractors weren't licensed in all the states, and we didn't get our final license until the late 70s in 2 states, incidentally, Louisiana and Massachusetts. And just coincidental, perhaps, but the 2 main proponents on the Committee on Quackery was Dr. Ballantyne and Dr. Sabatier. Ballantyne was from Massachusetts. Sabatier was from Louisiana. So
interesting.
I don't find it was coincidental that
probably
those
not
states had the worst situation. So when you think about, and then the other battle we had unknowingly was a battle that was so incredibly well executed by the AMA. It was the battle for the hearts and minds of the consuming public. And I often say, let's play a word game. And the word game is the very first word that you think of when you hear the word chiropractors. Was the AMA's goal was to make that word quack. So if you think about the fact that the consuming public, those who were going to utilize chiropractic services, had embedded in their minds that chiropractors were quacks, think about what we had to do to overcome that image among all the other battles that we had.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about battles, but all of those battles, Mike, shaped the way the profession essentially decided to strategically, strategically conquer them, if you will. That was one of them through legislation. And obviously we were successful in all of our legislation. We finally gained licensure in all the states. Litigation, of course, we definitely had the AMA litigation, as well as a number of other litigations against insurance companies and hospitals for discriminatory practices. And finally, the frontier that we're now emerging is the frontier of research. So it formed the way in which the chiropractic profession decided to move forward to resolve the battles that the profession saw since its inception in 1895.
I want to go back to a couple of things that you said. All these battles, and let's take, for example, the fight for accreditation for the educational institutions. Why was that a battle? Was there opposition to the chiropractic schools becoming accredited? Was that opposition primarily from the medical community? How did that battle come to fruition?
Many of our battles were actually self-inflicted wounds. There was 2. If I joke oftenly by saying if there were 2 chiropractors in one town, there'd be 2 organizations. So, and that's what happened essentially. There was 2 of everything. And so the accreditation process involved 2 national associations, each of them vying for the acceptance by the United States Department of Education to essentially be the accrediting body. The ICA lost that battle, and the ACA won that battle, and the Council on Chiropractic Education, CCE, was essentially adopted as the accrediting agency. And so what happened after that, of course, was that the schools that really wanted to survive, because frankly, the reason for accreditation also, Mike, was not only to enhance the quality of the education in the chiropractic colleges, but it opened up the floodgates of student loans. And without student loans, I mean, the profession would not have survived. But you had to be an accredited institution, in order to get student loans. So accreditation was a really big deal. And so ultimately, once CCE became the accrediting agency of choice by the United States Department of Education, those colleges and institutions that were aligned with the other side said, okay, if we want to continue to survive, we're going to have to become accredited by the United States Department of Education, CCE. And so what happened is that many of the battles that we fought were, first of all, self-inflicted wounds because we fought each other, but also most of the really progressive things that occurred to the profession were mandated by outside sources, and accreditation is actually one of the great examples of that. That we were sort of demanded to essentially accredit our schools.
Another thing that you said that I wanted to go back to was the AMA had created the Committee on Quackery, the COQ. They had their goal was to make chiropractic synonymous with quack, or quack synonymous with chiropractic. How did they do that? How did they approach this battle for the hearts and minds of America's consumer?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I will tell you, if this webinar would not be enough time to go into all the details, but I will tell you that it was a brilliantly executed plan. Okay, I'll give you some examples. First of all, the AMA put out a documentation that by their attorneys that hospitals had the legal right to exclude chiropractors. Once the institutions, the hospitals, and incidentally that we as taxpayers were paying for those hospitals, but the bottom line is the hospitals, under the guise of this particular legal mandate, basically would essentially not allow chiropractors to essentially order lab work, order x-rays, order admit, all of that. But now think about the fact that one of the reasons for the lawsuit's victory, Mike, was because it was really an economic boycott. And when you think about it, I recall going out, getting out of school and having to buy my own x-ray machine. Every chiropractor had to buy their x-ray machine. It was very expensive back then. And so the economics that were imposed upon the chiropractors that were never imposed upon any other profession, because they could utilize the hospital facilities to do their work, created an impediment, an economic impediment for the chiropractors. That's the first thing. Secondly, if you look at most of your insurance companies, they are either run by or have enormous influence by the AMA, and most of the insurance companies have a medical doctor as a director. Well, if you don't want to have chiropractors reimbursed, well, most of the things that either survive or don't survive are because of economics. So if chiropractors didn't get reimbursed or reimbursed adequately, they were going to die on the vine, which was a quote. And then, of course, you had the influence, Mike, in the publications. And the two that come to my mind were Consumers Report and Reader's Digest. Those were two publications that essentially were almost read by everybody. Now, remember, we're going BC, before computers. And so, and it almost seems like it's BC as well. I mean, when you think about it today, that we have, the internet, we have social media and all. I mean, none of that existed back then. Right. So where did the people get their information? They got it from journals. They got it from magazines. I mean, Reader's Digest was probably one of the most popular magazines in the country, and Consumers Report was read by just about everybody. Well, those two publications did some horrendous anti-chiropractic articles. Matter of fact, Consumers Report did 2 editions. That was not only in Consumer Report, but the medical societies of many states reprinted the articles in their entirety in their own publications to their own medical physicians, again, imposing and planting the fact that chiropractors were quacks, chiropractors were uneducated. So what they did was they turned the medical community against chiropractic, because once you start to believe that chiropractors are quacks, we don't have to think anymore. You hear the word chiropractor, and the medical physician basically discounted us as irrelevant. So they essentially brainwashed the medical community, they brainwashed the consumer community, and they had control of the hospitals and the insurance. Well, what more do you need? It was a magnificent plan, and it was perfectly executed. And that's what was strange, because who back then, Mike, would have ever dreamed that the AMA would do such a thing? I mean, it was as is often discussed, the AMA was often called the fourth branch of government without essentially being elected. And so the AMA was incredibly high esteem. And so what the AMA said, people believed. And so when you have the constellation of all those forces coming together with something that would today they'd put you in a padded cell as a conspiracy theorist. If you were talked about this back in the 60s and 70s, they looked at you like you were nuts. Who would think this? Who would do this? Well, it was done, and it was done with precision execution. I have to, as a strategist, Mike, I have to actually applaud the manner in which the AMA's program to contain and eliminate us was masterfully executed.
Another thing you said earlier, this was going on. They really launched this effort in 1963. And you said we didn't even know about it, and the profession didn't even know about it until really the lawsuit was filed in the mid 70s. How did we learn about it enough to file a lawsuit?
Interesting story. The book that was recently published, Contain and Eliminate, basically goes through a little bit of the history. And I'll give you a couple minutes of that. The Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, had written a book called Dianetics, and he thought that the AMA was going to absolutely embrace him and make him, hero for the day, and eliminate all of the problems surrounding postpartum depression and so forth. Well, the AMA categorically rejected him as some kind of wild man. Well, he wasn't about to be discarded, so he heard and got wind of the fact that the AMA was going to try to get the church, try to get the government to close the church down, the Church of Scientology. He knew that they were essentially bad-mouthing him. And so what he did, and he had quite an organization and quite a following. I mean, there's no question about the fact that he essentially had his own network. So what he did brilliantly, he planted some well-respected secretaries at the AMA headquarters as in jobs. They were so dedicated that they soon became an integral part of the infrastructure of the AMA, working late, doing great work, gaining access. And so pretty soon what they were looking for, their charge from the church, was essentially find out what the AMA is going to do against the Church of Scientology next. Well, as they're looking through these documents, and remember, Mike, again, no computers, no electronic. This is filing system. So everything had to be on paper. And so they were looking through these files and didn't find much about what the AMA was doing against the Church of Scientology. But what they did find was this conspiracy against chiropractors. So they figured, well, we might as well not let that kind of information go to waste. So basically, they packed up documents, several reams, if you will, and mailed them to groups of the organizations in chiropractic and some select individuals, and I happen to be one of those individuals who received this packet in a brown unmarked envelope one Saturday morning, and in it was the essentially documents from the AMA about their committee on quackery, the actual minutes, the actual documents. Well, I mean, I remember that like it was yesterday, Mike. After finishing my office hours in the morning, I sat down in the afternoon and read those documents. And it was like 1,000 pounds was taken off of my shoulders. I finally then understood what was happening, why my hospital wouldn't do laboratory work for me, why they wouldn't do x-rays for me, while the local physicians in town would not accept my referrals, why a whole host of things that never made sense. And it often, and I say this because the local family physician in town, one of my patients was the president of the Lions Club, and invited me to join the Lions Club. I joined the Lions Club. The following month, there was a letter read by the MD that basically said I have to resign from the Lions Club because I can't belong to an organization that would have a quack as a member. Well, I mean, Mike, you just can't wrap your arms around that, because there was no context, there was no understanding, there was no reason why this should occur, and yet all this time the AMA was in its clandestine activities, doing all of these things and imposing this negative concept of chiropractic to all of the physicians that were essentially involved with the AMA. So that's kind of the context. How did it happen, and how did we know? Well, then once we got the documents, then came another. You talk about battles. Well, came another challenge. How do you find a lawsuit? How do you find a law firm that would take on litigating against the AMA? I mean, it just didn't happen. Well, they're very clever, and corporations do this same thing today, Mike. What they do is they basically hire all the best law firms, they put them on a small retainer. And once the law firms are on a retainer, then they can't file an action against their client. So the AMA had almost all the lawyers on retainer for the most part. And if the lawyers weren't on retainer, they'd think you were nuts. I mean, you talk about David and Goliath. I mean, it really was. I remember the lawyers who just simply looked at you like, you were kind of nuts. We can't find a law firm that will take this on. And that's kind of how Jerry McAndrews and his brother George ultimately got involved in George taking on the lawsuit. And without McAndrews taking on the lawsuit, I doubt seriously if we'd have ever had a law firm that would have accepted us as a client.
And that's so the AMA is based in Chicago, Illinois, and the case was venued in Illinois as well, too, right? So that was the issue, getting an attorney to.
Not that I remember, but it's 535 Dearborn Street. Not that I recall. You know what I mean? This is 50 years ago, and I remember their address like it was yesterday.
Yeah. So the attorneys were concerned that if they take on the AMA, they'll never work in that town again.
Exactly.
I would imagine.
Actually, that's kind of what happens.
Yeah. So one more question on this. Incidentally, for our listeners, we will put some links to some resources that, like the book that Dr. Sportelli mentioned. We'll put links to those so you can look at those in the show notes of the webinar. But I'm curious, if you hadn't gotten that unmarked manila envelope with documents from the Church of Scientology, would the lawsuit have ever happened?
Well, there was. I don't know. That's a great question, Mike. I don't know, but I can tell you that after that, and the book In the Public Interest was published, Jerry McAndrews bought the rights to that, published it, because in the book was all of these same documents. But the thing that George kind of taught us. I mean, taught us a lot of law along the way in this lawsuit. And he said, "Look, those are unverifiable. I mean, we don't know if they're accurate or not. Anybody could publish and do whatever they want to." Well, when the lawsuit was filed, Mike, here's an interesting little tidbit for the listening audience. When the lawsuit was filed, the courts always impose a preservation of documents. They basically say to the clients on either side, to the plaintiffs and the defendants, you will preserve documents. Well, the AMA claimed they were going to preserve the documents, and so they dutifully preserved the documents, Mike. What they did was they preserved their documents in a big sort of a trash container with wheels. Okay. Well, I know this is going to be, I know that they were totally and completely honest about this. I know that they were totally and completely unaware of what's going to happen. But guess what, Mike? When they were supposed to present the documents, they basically told the court that the janitors had mistaken them for trash, and therefore they were destroyed. Mm-hmm. Now, George McAndrews, and thankfully at this time this was still before the internet and before social media. So what McAndrews did was he went to, if my memory serves me, something like 40 states, and went to the headquarters of the state medical societies with a subpoena to get the documents. And guess what, Mike? They didn't get the memo. So in many of these state associations had the very memos that the AMA sent to those medical societies, and therefore the verification and validation and authenticity of the documents were done and made relevant by George's going to all these medical societies. Wow. Unbelievably tiring task, but it was the way in which he authenticated the validity of the documents.
So sounds like throughout the case there were a lot of obstacles thrown up that it took a lot of skill and cunning to overcome.
Absolutely. So, and I mean, the profession will know that we lost the first suit and won the second one, and that's a tale which is very interesting as well.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. A big part of your history and your experience within the chiropractic profession is actually with NCMIC. You came onto the board in the mid-1990s, and that too was a battle of sorts. How did you come to be a board member of NCMIC and its president for 20 years?
Well, not that I have sort of an uneasy feeling when I think things aren't going right, Mike. So I did not feel that the NCMIC, at the time I was involved with the ACA. I was on their board of governors, and I ultimately became chair of the board of ACA. And we started asking the board of NCMIC some interesting questions about, who gets sued, what's the statistics, and so forth and so on. And they were essentially dismissal of any inquiry we had. And then they did a couple of things that we essentially thought were a little on the strange side. And they just simply were non-responsive. So I said, I guess the only way to do this is to put up a battle and put up a candidate. And what I didn't like was the lack of transparency. I didn't like the fact that NCMIC, for the 10 years prior to my getting involved, I mean, there wasn't one innovative program or one innovative product that came out of NCMIC. It was just kind of there. And having been started in practice in 1963 and working my way through not only all of the organizations, but in practice, I kind of knew what the DC's in the field who were actually, I mean, I was a field practitioner, and that's what I did. That's what I was. And so I knew what we needed as a profession. I knew what we needed as a practitioner. I didn't see any of those things that were creative coming out of NCMIC. So we launched the campaign, and needless to say, it was a how should I say? It might be called, in today's terminology, it might have been called a hostile takeover, but I don't think so. And the reason I say I don't think it's a hostile takeover, because when you can win an election with a write-in candidate that got more votes than the ones that were already on the printed ballot, it would seem to me that the policyholders were actually speaking loudly. And that's how we won the election, is that they wrote a write-in candidate, which is essentially unheard of. It's just unheard of.
And why was that important to you?
Well, it was important because it's the only way you could get on the board. It was the only way you could, because the way the structure was, you either had to be nominated by the nominating committee or you had to do a write-in campaign. Well, try doing a write-in campaign. It's impossible.
Right. But why, you saw these issues with NCMIC. Why was it important for you to take action? Why was it important for you to get involved with NCMIC instead of saying, "Oh, they're going down the tubes or whatever"? So be it. Why was it important for you to step in?
That's a good question, Mike, and it's a twofold. Number one, my early mentor in the 60s was a malpractice attorney who was my very dear friend and basically taught me a lot about malpractice in the 60s that I never knew about, but also taught me some of the avenues we needed to do in order to qualify as a profession. Then in Pennsylvania, NCMIC basically lost its ability to sell to policyholders because of a technicality. It was called the long arm statute. And so for probably almost 15 years in Pennsylvania, NCMIC could not sell insurance, and I was affected so fortunately, we were politically involved in Pennsylvania. We got the insurance commissioner to, the original insurance commissioner wanted NCMIC to drop all of its policies, so we'd have been totally uninsured. Well, we finally convinced them that the ones that were insured, let it stay, just don't have any new ones. So for 15 years, there was no new policyholders for NCMIC. But more importantly, Mike, the response from the company, and I wasn't involved in it, but I wasn't involved in the company, but I was involved in the political end of Pennsylvania. They were just non-responsive. They just were non-responsive to a real, in my view, a very serious matter. And so that kind of got me a little worked up, I must confess. And then when I got to a point where I got involved with ACA and I was able to ask them some pertinent questions with that platform, their answers were less than stellar. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, you know what, this is a good company, but the leadership just isn't there. And that's how I felt. And so I decided to do what I always do, kick the door in if it doesn't open.
Take action. All right. Well, one of the issues, let's shift gears again a little bit. That has always, thank you for sharing that. That history has always kind of fascinated me as a long-term employee of NCMIC. That all took place before I got here, so it's interesting to me. One of the issues that does seem to arise frequently within the chiropractic profession is philosophy. How has chiropractic philosophy shaped your years in practice and informed your advocacy?
A good question. Let me make one point on your former question, sure. Mike. Obviously, throughout my entire career, business has always been an area of interest for me. And so I look at the business of the state association that I was involved in, the business acumen of the National Association, and of course the business acumen of NCMIC. Well, here is a company that basically up until 1985, Mike, did not have one professional on the board, one insurance professional. It was just so it was not really run like like a business. And it boggles my mind that we're dealing with my malpractice. And then once we got on the board, I will tell you, and obviously NCMIC today, I often say, I don't know what the profession would be like without it. But what happened was the board was all chiropractors, as there are so many boards of all chiropractors. The one thing that I was able to accomplish was to get the new board to recognize that we needed public members on our board. And once the public members got on our board, Mike, the world simply changed. We brought in a new board of business professionals, financial people, people with banking, people with credit card expertise. And so the company just began to not only provide the services and products that the profession needed, but it was run like a business. And now today, under the second group of management, it's even taken to another level. The way NCMIC is operating today is just absolutely incredible. And then to sidebar here for a moment, what was one of the areas that was so incredibly critical was the research. And NCMIC started a foundation in 2003, which has now proven to be one of the more avant-garde institutions doing things to advance the profession in a research way. So I wanted to say that in the early 90s, it was still chiropractors, and frankly, chiropractors really are their own lawyers, their own public relations. But no, if you're gonna run a business, run it like a business, and bring people that are competent in their areas of expertise onto the board, and that's what we did, and that's why NCMIC is so phenomenal today.
Thank you for that.
So now you get back to the philosophy.
Yeah, and I was just asking, how has your chiropractic philosophy shaped your years in practice and informed your advocacy?
Well, that is, I graduated. I went to Palmer, and I started in 1959, and I'm very thankful because halfway through my career, BJ died in 61, so he was still kind of there. But the giants of our profession, who were the philosophy giants, Mike, are the instructors that I basically had. So I was imbued with an old time chiropractic philosophy that was essentially that chiropractic is for well people to keep them well. Okay, I mean it was so much broader than back pain, and so that was kind of how I practiced. My thought process was when I left. I remember this like it was yesterday. I left Palmer College, and I thought my philosophy, my mission, and my goal was to see 1,000 healthy, happy patients once a month. That was what was in my mindset. So put aside the fact that philosophy is a challenge, only because the biggest challenge isn't the chiropractic philosophy, Mike. The biggest challenge is the way in which we use words. Because even during the early problems with BJ Palmer and getting chiropractors getting arrested and put in jail for practicing medicine without a license, we developed a lexicon that's actually crippled us for a long time. So we started changing words. We didn't diagnose, we analyzed. We didn't cure, we adjusted. So language really became part of keeping you out of jail for practicing medicine without a license. And a lot of the language of our new legislation, Mike, was put in there out of fear, as opposed to, so it was limited. We wanted to protect and preserve the little bit of language in chiropractic, as opposed to saying chiropractic is the treatment of human health and disease without the use of drugs or surgery. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful worldwide definition of what chiropractic is? And yet what we tried to do is we tried to almost become so specific that it applied only to chiropractic, and we were hampered by it. So the philosophy piece that you're talking about is interesting. And I will say that philosophy is now becoming less and less and less. And the reason I say this, Mike, is just 2 weeks ago, and I want to quote the name of this. The name of the article just 2 weeks ago was cited as Chronic Health Conditions and Health Behaviors for the 2016 to 2018 National Health Interview Survey of the International Journal of Environmental Resources. Now, I laughed at that when that came out a couple of weeks ago. Why did I laugh at that? Because here's what it said. All 4 chronic health conditions significantly increased the prevalent odds of spinal pain. Cardiovascular conditions by 58%, hypertension by 40%, diabetes by 20%, and obesity by 34%. Controlling for all co-founders for all the chronic health conditions. So spinal pain is involved in all of those. And you know, Mike, when I graduated, patients came in. They came in out of desperation. They came in to chiropractors back in the 60s. Out of desperation, they've tried everything else. While most of the conditions were back pain because we had tracks and all we were talking about is back pain, neck pain, headache, and posture. But the people came in with those conditions. And ironically, Mike, their blood pressure would reduce. I live in Pennsylvania. We're in the cold country. So pneumoconiosis, black lung was prevalent. Well, patients came into my office with black lung, Mike. You take an x-ray and you knew it was black lung. They couldn't walk from my parking lot into my reception room. And after a few weeks of care, they were able to walk several blocks. And you take another x-ray, black lung was still there. What we were doing was we were treating functional disorders and making them better. Everything from blood pressure to cardiovascular disease. And when we said that back then they really thought we were out of our mind as practitioners. But today, now the research is starting to show that people with spinal pain have an influence on all of the comorbidities. I am so thrilled with some of this research that's coming out. It will change the entire paradigm of how and why chiropractic is utilized by the public and how and why chiropractic is viewed by the professionals that need to send patients to us.
Yeah,
I will tell you, it's hard after all these years. I'm still excited about the fact that we're now starting to fundamentally get 360 degrees from where we were. We said we could cure everything. When I graduated, we could grow hair on a bowling ball with chiropractic adjustments. Well, today, we're starting to see research that's actually evidence. And we're talking about conditions like depression that chiropractic has an influence on, and high blood pressure, and all of the things that are now becoming chronic. And we're getting away little by little. Patients are starting to understand that there's not a pill for every ill, that it's about lifestyle interventions. And many of the things that we're talking about today, exercise and nutrition and all of that was part of early chiropractic. It just never was publicized much.
Yeah. And that's a great segue into my next question. As the profession continues to evolve and progress, what's next? Where do we go from here? And I think that you've hit on a lot of your thoughts on this. But any other thoughts as far as, where is the profession going?
Absolutely. Where it's going to go, I don't think there's any question in my mind that the next evolution is the word integration. The day of the solo practitioner in an office is limited. It just is. I often say, Mike, what we don't want to do is train taxi drivers in an Uber world. And so where are we? So who was it? Grusky basically says, I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck will be. Well, we need to position ourselves to where the puck will be. And where will that be? It'll be in integration. So the fact of the matter is, we're starting to see now that no single profession has all the answers. However, the irony of the integration piece is that there was an old time mantra that said chiropractic first, medicine second, surgery last. Well, actually, that wasn't so crazy, and it isn't so crazy today.
Mhm.
So what's happening is that process in an integrated setting where there are people that come into the healthcare system and are triaged appropriately. So and we now know that there are multiple studies that determine that the doctor you choose often determines the pathway and what happens to you. So if you're going to choose and you get triaged into the most conservative practitioner you have, which is chiropractic for sure, look at what will happen to the way healthcare is delivered. And from an economic point of view, not only there's nothing sexy about back pain, but it is probably 50% of the population's afflicted by it, and the enormous toll on productivity and disability is astronomical. If it were any other condition, there would be a Manhattan Project to how do we solve this? Well, the bottom line is now we're starting to see the evidence that not only the practitioner that you go to, but the way in which you're triaged and the amount of conditions that are affected by back pain, everything from depression to high blood pressure. Let's start incorporating this, and the world is moving toward integration. So there's no question in my mind that the next level is going to be a level of integration.
Okay. Well, Dr. Sportelli, thank you so much. Just a few more questions, a little bit more personal in nature. As you look back over your long and accomplished career, do you have any regrets?
No regrets, Mike. And I say no regrets only because when you're undertaking a project, I mean, you're so busy going through it, you don't really have time to think about regrets. You don't have time to think about success or failure. You're thinking about success, and then you move incrementally forward to the strategy that you develop. And sometimes you have to change, but you change course all along the way. And ultimately what happens a lot of times, and I've found this out multiple times, what I thought was a disaster turned out to be one of the greatest opportunities that I had in the evolution of that particular project. So I have absolutely no regrets, Mike. I think the involvement has been, first of all, a labor of love, and a labor of one of the things that drove me all of these years, Mike, was an injustice. There was an inherent injustice to the profession. And for some reason or other, and why that bothered me and stayed with me forever, was my involvement always said, how can we eliminate this injustice? And so almost every project that I've ever undertaken has had a segment of injustice to it. And so I have no regrets at all. Absolutely none.
Great. So kind of the flip side of that, you've accomplished a lot. You've been involved in a lot. What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? That's a tough one. I think I'm proud of all of them, Mike, in terms of the context of where they were. But if you say most proud, I will say NCMIC has been my biggest source of pride for a variety of reasons, because it has been the enabler to correct a lot of the things that were wrong with the profession. It provided the practitioners with products and services that we were only dreaming about in the 50s and 60s and 70s, And NCMIC in the 90s and from now on has provided everything from merchant processing to credit cards to business loans to all of the things that the chiropractors needed, that when I went into my bank, I mean, they wouldn't give me a loan, Mike. I mean, that's all there is to it. And every other professional that graduated with a degree, they could walk into the bank and almost on a signature get a loan. Not chiropractors. We couldn't get equipment loans. We couldn't get business loans. We couldn't get any kind of thing like that. So NCMIC has essentially opened up the door. And their slogan, we take care of our own, is not a slogan. It's the way we operate. And then the second piece of that was the foundation has enabled us to do things like provide fellowships in institutions that if we had mentioned in the 90s that we would have affiliation and fellowships at Harvard and Yale and University of Minnesota, and Mike, we'd be locked up in a padded cell. And today we have programs that are going to happen in universities in the United States. So the pride comes in the global growth of the recognition and appreciation of what chiropractic can do and where it is. And I think we've almost removed most of that stigma. And I recall, we used to joke about the chiropractic being an O doctor. So you go to someplace at a party and you say, "Oh, you're Dr. So-and-so. What kind of a doctor are you?" "I'm a chiropractor." "Oh." And now today, you can't say you're a chiropractor without somebody bending your ear and asking for solid professional advice. Mm-hmm. That's a paradigm shift in thought process, Mike. So my pride comes in the recognition of where the profession has come in the 60 years of my involvement.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Sportelli, thank you so much for talking with us today. I've enjoyed our conversation very much. As a side note, I've had the privilege of working with you for almost 23 years now. And I consider you to be one of my mentors. And I am so grateful to have had this opportunity to work with you, to travel with you. I've learned so much from you. But what always strikes me is when I am out and about and I'm talking to doctors and people ask me how you're doing, and it's in the context of they consider you to be a mentor as well. So thank you on behalf of myself and others that have considered you a mentor, a friend, somebody to kind of guide the way through the chiropractic profession for us. So appreciate you very much.
Mike, thank you.
Finally, Dr. Sportelli, thank you for talking with me. Thank you for sharing these stories with our audience. I appreciate it very much. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. So that's something that I value greatly. Before we go, I'd like to remind our listeners of our resources page on ncmic.com. This webinar will be posted there as soon as the recording's processed, and you can find our past webinars out there as well. While you're on our resources page, have a look around. We have a ton of information out on our website focused on topics of your daily practice. So take a look out there. It's all for free, all for you to use. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Our next webinar, again, is scheduled for Thursday, January 18th at 2 p.m. Central Time, and I hope you'll be able to join us. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to having you continue to join us for our monthly webinars throughout 2024. Happy holidays, everybody, and we'll see you next year.